Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update, a federal policy developments report from the One Voice Government Affairs and Strategic Communications team in DC. This webinar is a production of the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. On today's webinar, we also have Paul Nathanson from Bracewell and the team from the Franklin Partnership. That is Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. If you are new to these webinars, just so you know, Bracewell does communication for NTMA and PMA. We focus on advocacy, getting the word out about small and medium-sized manufacturers and trying to advocate for policies that are advantageous to manufacturers. And the Franklin Partnership team is your on-the-ground registered lobbyists here in DC. These webinars are now on Zoom. This is our second Zoom webinar. So if you want to ask a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel. You can find that down at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor, you'll get that little Q&A bubble. You can click on that. Don't send us a message in the chat. We won't be able to see that, but send us a message in the Q&A and we will be happy to answer your questions so long as we have time or follow up with you after. Speaking of after, you can find a recording of this webinar on the website onevoiceinfo.org. You can also get the webinar and slides from NTMA or PMA, but onevoiceinfo.org is a place where you can find this deck as well as all of our previous webinars. You can find recordings there if you want to listen again or share it with someone else. Lots to cover as usual. I'll show you a brief agenda here. We'll talk about what's going on in Congress. Most of Congress headed out now for a summer recess. And of course, getting focused on election 2024, but still a little activity in Congress to report. So we will certainly do that. Talk about some of the regulatory things that you should know, specifically the heat rule from OSHA, give you a couple of other regulatory updates, lots of things. Look at this. This is everything that's going to be covered in this webinar, but some things obviously will be covered very briefly. So this is more of a reference tool. Come back, look at this, control find if you need to search for what was in this report and find places to search it. Somebody is sending emoji reactions and I am into that. So it looks like you can also send reactions. So please feel free, do that throughout the webinar as well. And make everyone regret transitioning to Zoom. So lots to cover. Let me turn it over quickly to you, John. Get us started, and I will hold back from submitting emojis while you talk.
Well, thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, as this content, as you had pointed out, there's a lot to go over in this webinar. I think this is a record over 50 pages, and we're going to knock it out in the 30-minute period. But as you correctly mentioned, the House and Senate, as of yesterday, have recessed for their August break, so they don't come back until September 9th. But as we had mentioned in the previous webinar, and we've mentioned for a while now, is that the goal of the House, I'm going to talk a little bit about appropriations. The goal of House Republicans was to pass all 12 appropriations bills on the House floor before they adjourned for the August recess. While the best laid plans have fallen apart, the House was only able to pass 5 appropriations bills. They're laid out there. Let's see, defense, military construction, state, homeland security, but they did pass them all out of committees. What the House Republicans were doing is they were moving appropriations bills at in a partisan basis. So even though there was a slim 3 or 4 seat majority for House Republicans, these bills had to be carried by the Republicans because the Democrats were not going to vote for them because of steep budget cuts. And then there's some cultural language that is included in many of the bills regarding abortion and LGBTQ rights and such. And so that's why they had to pass with Republicans, and they're unable to do that before they broke for their August recess. Conversely, on the Senators have been working in a very bipartisan fashion with Senator Collins, the ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee. While they haven't passed any of the appropriations bills on the Senate floor, 11 of the 12 appropriations bills have passed Senate committee. The only holdout is Homeland Security. And so when the Congress comes back in September, they're hopeful that they'll start being able to address some of those pending appropriations bills. There's procedural hoops that Senator Schumer and the majority have to pass in the Senate. So it does take up a lot of floor time for just one bill to pass the United States Senate. And so we don't expect all 12 of these appropriations bills to be conferenced with the House. Most likely the Congress is going to start working on, when they come back on September 9th, a continuing resolution to keep the government funded past the September 30th deadline. Let's move over to taxes. We've talked about for several months now of the pending tax bill that the House overwhelmingly passed earlier this year, which incorporates an RD fix, full expensing, business loan deductibility. The Senate, for those of you who watched the news yesterday, the Senate failed to reach a cloture on that House passed bill. 48 yes votes, 44 votes against. They needed 60 votes to bring it to the floor for consideration. Notable senators who voted for the bill: Josh Hawley of Missouri, Senator Mullen from Oklahoma, and Rick Scott from Florida. Notable no's: Bernie Sanders from Vermont, not a big surprise there. Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Senator Schumer voted no, but that's more of a procedural thing, so that the House, so that the Senate can bring it back later this year if they deem it necessary. We are starting to hear that the House may consider a slimmed down version of a tax bill. What would that look like? We've been asked. It's a little uncertain at this point. A slimmed down version, maybe a 2-year extension of the research and development bonus depreciation. It may not be as expansive on retroactivity as the current bill has. And so know that we'll be working aggressively on your behalf to make sure that some of this tax relief does get taken care of this year. So on the Senate side, on the workforce front, the Senate committee released their education bill recently. They introduced a draft bill in June of the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. That is the major funding, education, training, and employment funding bill that sets parameters at the Department of Labor. And so this authorization, which last passed in 2014, needs to be reauthorized. And so the House passed it overwhelmingly in a bipartisan way in April, 378 votes. We did submit comments during the drafting period with our coalition partners. There's some highlights and lowlights of the bill. The Senate bill does not include individual training accounts. It did create qualified intermediary definitions for funding, and it did create definitions for youth apprenticeships moving forward.
Yeah, so the comments I drafted, so a few things on this one, and we can go back to taxes as well, but we'll maybe address those in some Q&A and on appropriations. But on the workforce side, we did, in addition to the coalition comments were a little bit more focused on language that Senator Sanders included in the workforce bill that was related to blacklisting of employers from participating in WIOA and Workforce Investment Board oriented projects if they've got NLRB or other union-related violations. We oppose that and some other Sanders-related language. In our comments specifically that I drafted and we submitted on behalf of NTMA and PMA, we are more focused on issues such as the individual training accounts. Those are not included in the Senate in terms of a 50% base requirement for those funds to go towards actual training programs that are offered by industry and employers. So in that language that's included in the House, that would benefit both associations that are providing any of those types of training and credentials and other services that are subject and eligible for WIOA funding, which is part of the reason why, as associations, we flagged that and wanted to push on that as well. On the qualified intermediary definition, that can be a plus and a minus. So that again goes back down to who's going to be eligible to participate in those programs to receive funding. And in some of the language, we're hoping to make sure that it does include that trade associations and their foundations would also be eligible as some of those training fundings that are there as well. The concern that we raised, and there were two other things that we created here, raised concern. One was specific to PMA, and then one was broader. The Senate language also eliminates the ability of some young people, 16 and 17-year-olds, to work in any hazardous industry, and that include the entire NAICS codes for manufacturing. Whereas currently the Department of Labor has several hazardous exemptions. There's, I believe, 8 of them, and one of them is on presses that is exempt in certain scenarios to have a minor that's enrolled in a certain program, obviously credentialed with the school and all that to participate. The Senate language would not permit that exemption to continue. So we flagged that as well. And our concern on the youth apprenticeships language the Senate has is that definition has some overlap to what the Department of Labor is currently working on their apprenticeship rule. So that's something that we flagged for them as well. But we're already at 12:11 Eastern, so we're going to keep things moving along. And please, happy to answer any questions in the chat on where things might be on that. On the WIOA side, since they didn't get to a markup yet in the Senate, they're still taking stakeholder feedback. That workforce bill likely will see some action in September from the committee we're hearing before they leave for the elections, and then with the hope of doing some kind of reconciliation in the lame duck with the House passed bill. In this next section here, and we're not going to go through this all because we've sent it out previously to some folks, the Department of Labor did finally release its indoor and outdoor heat rule. When the heat index reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit, there's certain restrictions starting with called the initial trigger. They made the high heat trigger at 90 degrees heat index rather than the 87 as was initially floated. So for the next 20 or so slides, we're going to give you an idea of what they are, but more importantly, where to find them. As you're looking at this slide here, give you a sense of where we are. The Department of Labor has not officially published this rule in the Federal Register yet, meaning this is still a proposed rule that is still pending. There's a backlog of about 4 to 6 weeks with the Federal Register for some of the larger rules and proposals that the regulators are putting out, which is what we're hearing is leading to this delay since we've had this now rule since July 2nd. Once it is published in the Federal Register, that begins an official 120-day clock, and we will be submitting comments on our own as One Voice and also in partnership with our coalition partners, that Coalition for Workplace Safety and some of the other associations and groups around town. This rule does apply to all industries. It does not differentiate between indoor, outdoor. Well, it does. It does not differentiate between certain occupations within manufacturing or even across different sectors that are out there. There's a number of different record keeping requirements in here. As you can see, weather acclimatization for both new and returning workers, the mandatory breaks, and some where this ends up. If we do have this published in the next few weeks, as expected by the end of the month, then the rules will be due, the comments will be due within 120 days. The Department of Labor will take some time to review that. There will likely be a public hearing. Then that will take about another 90 days before they get to the final rule, and then the final rule will take effect. I believe it's 120 days even after that. So we're looking at 2026, most likely, if there's a Kamala Harris administration, and if there's a Donald Trump administration, we'll see what the courts and other states do and moving forward. And again, this would apply to all employers. You'll all be required to create a heat injury illness prevention plan that would be site-specific information to evaluate and control the heat hazards in those workplaces. You'd also have all those employers to have to identify the work areas where there is the potential hazard and incorporate that into your overall heat plan. This is similar to the chart that we would have shown you back in October of last year on our monthly slide decks, where it goes and gives you an idea at who is covered, when is covered. All employers, regardless of the time, heat, temperature, anything, you have to have already identified heat hazard, have some emergency response procedures in place, have already trained employees and supervisors, and regardless of size of employer, have some kind of record keeping in place, and also with the heat injury and illness prevention plan for those with 10 or more employees. At the initial heat trigger, again, that's that 80-degree heat index, and then the high heat that is at 90 degrees, and that's where you can see the different supervisor buddy systems have to start taking effect as well in many of these 90-degree areas and thresholds. And you can go and click on the link below. There's a couple of page fact sheet here that we clipped on here that kind of gives you an idea of the mandatory rest breaks that are required. And now switching from the actual fact sheet, we did go through in our shop we read through the entire rule, and you can now see that proposed regulation as it would be written right there by clicking on that link. It will not apply to the short duration employee exposures. If your heat trigger of 15 minutes or less in any 60-minute period, that is consistent with the proposal, or rather the framework that was floated last September by OSHA. That is consistent there. Where air conditioning consistently keeps ambient temperatures below 80 degrees, that is something that is your out. So if you are an air conditioned facility and you are keeping it below 80 degrees, remember at the workstation, not just in the break room or the QC, then you are also exempt. But again, you're going to have to document that you are at that and below that temperature there as well. Somebody asked us on a webinar recently if it applies to telework. This is your answer. It does not apply to telework. And also folks that are in the office setting, it will not apply to them if they are just walking brief periods of time, picking up things weighing less than 10 pounds. So those are the exemptions. But again, consistent with the framework from last year, over 10 employees must have a written plan. So were this to take effect, you must have a plan. Keep in mind, you already are required to have heat incorporated into your employee safety plans since the April 8th of 2022 National Emphasis Program on heat from OSHA was released. So that's already a requirement to have heat incorporated in your safety plans. But if this were to go into effect, everyone with 10 employees or more would have to go there and seek the input from their employees as well in that process. The plan is also, this one, we had a call with some folks at the Small Business Administration and another one separately with some lawyers on this. But note that the plan must be available in the language each employee, supervisor, and heat safety coordinator understands. That's pretty specific here in where it comes out. And what the concern here is a couple of things. It's in the language, but there's also additional paragraph in the rule that also says that it must be written in a way that the employee can understand. So this now speaks to what is that employee's literacy level. Literally, this is how the lawyers are addressing this and saying this is not just about Spanish, English, Vietnamese, pick your language. It is then within that language, can the employee understand the safety manual and the requirement that's there? We had a question of, is it 10 employees per location or total per company? It's my understanding and recollection, it's per facility is how it's defined, similar to how if OSHA is going to come over for an inspection, they'll look at it that way, similar to just going by it versus the establishment. So my understanding, it's on facility, and we will verify that on the next one. So that's where you get your 10 or more head count there as well. We also had a question recently on the heat metric used on the wet bulb globe temperature that would factor in not just the ambient air, but ambient conditions and the heat index, and also the humidity and also the wind also factors into that. And then the employer will monitor. So you're going to have to pick which one you're going to use and be consistent in that as well. Obviously, if there's an injury or an incident that occurs, you're going to have to review your plan, understand what happened and how you can prevent that in the future. The employer must designate one or more heat safety coordinators. And this also came up with the attorneys. What happens if that individual is out for that day? He or she is ill or traveling, etc. So you were probably going to have to train more than one person on this, on how to implement and monitor what's going on in that environment as well. And same thing, their clothing, their PPE, in terms of the break that are going to be required, change in production process, also going to have to do additional training on there as well. If there's a reasonable expectation that they're exposed to heat, you're going to have to identify those workstations and make those folks aware of it as well when they come in and enter in from there. There are some areas that are exempt from some monitoring, but the requirements that are above that initial heat trigger, you can start seeing that drinking water that is suitably cool. Again, what does that mean? Of sufficient quantity to provide access to 1 quart of drinking water per employee per hour. This is literally the regulation. So now we've switched to copying and pasting so you can actually see when they're talking about increased air movement such as fans. But the issue that they then come say in cases of radiant heat sources that effectively reduce employee exposure radiant heat in the work area, then there's some other areas that they have some concerns that the fan might actually push around more of that heat and actually make it hotter. As we wrap up this heat section, just do want to flag, since this has come up quite a bit with regards to weather acclimatization for new employees and returning employees, they are looking at a similar process that's actually been around in OSHA for quite some time. With regards to 50-20 rule, or 5-20 rule rather. So they're going to say that on the first day, you restrict to 20% of normal work shift on the first day, 40% of the second day, 60% third day, 80% on the fourth day. And then on day 5, again, with the 520 rule that they've had around, I think, since the early 80s, this is now what they're trying to put now into the rule book. That's for new employees. For returning employees, there are some additional issues with regards to how long they've been away. So if it's for more than 14 days, it's going to be very specific, folks, if this goes in there. And on this one, they're doing more of a gradual acclimatization of 50, 60, and 80% on third day of work before getting them back fully up to speed on the day 4. But again, it comes back to in their comments, they say that just go have the employee work somewhere else rather than send them home and do nothing. So that's kind of the issues there. They do have an exemption that they do have if they have worked in the similar condition within the past 14 days. So even if someone's been in industry their entire life and took a month off, they're going to have to go through the weather acclimatization that are out there as well. Rest breaks are similar that were out there. They did clarify that a meal break can count as one of those rest breaks every 2 hours if that high heat trigger does trigger a 15-minute and warrant a 15-minute break that's out there. They do know that when they are putting on and taking off the PPE, that will not count towards their total time provided for rest breaks. That was something that was specifically brought up to OSHA in one of our SBREFA panels in early September of last year, as well as they take a look at that. Mandatory buddy system. This is also something that we could see significant impact on a number of shops, particularly as many are increasing their automation and employees are spaced out and may not be within visual sight of one another. That'll put additional onus with regards to that supervisor. And then obviously on hazard alerts, excessive heat areas, all of those safety coordinator trainings, many of them. The one final slide here is on record keeping, and keep in mind, for those of you in California have started to deal with this now that we're past August 1st and the indoor rule as well. This electronic records of those indoor work area measurements and retain those temperature records for 6 months. California was looking at 12 months. This 6 months is still quite significant in that, keep in mind, you have to be measuring this stuff now, either in regular intervals or in real time, and now keeping it for that long. And that's something that, again, is going to add to additional burden. And that's the just in case there is an incident, they want to be able to review it. And as you can see, the compliance date here is the standard will be published, and the final rule will be 60 days rather than the 90. And the compliance days, that's where they gave you the extra 30 in the 150. So same amount of compliance total, as I mentioned. This would have to be once it's published in the final register, and that would likely not be until next year. Jumping over to some other regulatory items, and please include any questions you've got there. As always, this slide deck will be sent out for reference later. Again, please keep in mind that is just a proposed rule at this point, but we expect if it is a Harris administration that it would likely mimic some of that. If it is a Trump administration, we would likely expect to see states on their own moving forward with similar approaches and lawsuits by state attorneys general to try to trigger a federal OSHA standard as well. There is some Chevron deference issues following the Supreme Court ruling that likely will be addressing and focusing more on how did they come up with 80 degrees rather than whether or not OSHA has the authority itself, but we are still seeing how those would have to wait for a final rule to come out. Briefly, trichloroethylene, we've been talking about this one since the first term of Obama, that the EPA always had it on its list to eliminate, and they are getting really close to doing that. It is under final rule review by the White House, so if you are using trichloroethylene, TCE, in any degreasing in any part of your shops, now, especially if you're in aerospace, I think that's where it was most prevalent, in some automotive, you need to start figuring out an alternative now. Similar on propane, that is also on the list, except this is going to be a proposed rule, whereas the TCE is in final stages. Most commercial and industrial uses, with a couple of exclusions, are going to be banned. We understand that there's some applications this is used as a metal degreaser as well, and a cleaner. So that's something to focus on if you have 1BP in your shops to look at. Over on the agency side related to workforce space, National Labor Relations Board has given up on fighting the joint employer rule fight that they've been pushing for some time. This is a rule that the Obama administration put in its final days, that for those of you that are using staff agencies, temp agencies, and those kinds of companies, that it would deem you as a joint employer with more than one other company if you are doing indirect control over the terms and conditions of the employees, hiring, firing, wages, hours, and all that. Trump overrode that, and now Biden tried to reverse it back to. Doesn't matter. In the end, the courts fought it, and the Biden administration has said they are not going to continue, so that now it reverts back to the Trump joint rule standard there as well. Similar on the ESG issues, in light of the Chevron deference decision that came out, back in late June by the Supreme Court that completely changes how agencies will have to address some of their rulemaking on some of the ESG issues, those that have been reliant on agencies saying that the courts defer to us so we can go broader. Those are now being challenged as well, which means that the courts have now said, in light of the Chevron deference, you have to review some of these as well. On the European side, we put this in here because this has changed a little bit since we reported on it back towards the winter time. And also increasingly, we're hearing from our members that you're getting requests from your customers who are hearing from their OEMs about having to comply on some environmental reporting requirements. And that includes corporate sustainability due diligence. And that's where you see in here, with regards to the European Union, they changed the scope in terms of the size of employees that have to comply with it, with regards to 1,000 employees or more and 450 million euros or more in terms of net worldwide. So that's not going to hit very many of our companies, if any. However, there are some large non-EU companies, and there are going to be some reporting requirements that some of those businesses might seek to ask of you. And so start to be aware that there's going to be a 3 to 5 year phase in. And this is similar to what you might be seeing out of California and New York for some others there as well. This should impact not too many, but just in case, we do have some folks that are buying or leasing some clean vehicles. And this has several things. This is for consumers, but also for consumers lease and new vehicles, but also for commercial clean vehicle credit. So for some of your shops that are purchasing or leasing these, there is a FAQ that's been updated on what is eligible and what is not. Rather than going through all of it, we're just providing you a link from the IRS, since they just put this out last week. If you are involved in that, please forward that to your CFO and your CPA. Similar for this one on as well about energy tax credit scams from some that are coming and promising you to give you a cut of anyone that's dealing with 1040s. Also, that's a scam that IRS has flagged earlier last month on it as well. Keep in mind that dollars are still going out from this administration, and they're going to keep pushing it out even more quickly, especially as it relates to electric vehicle and plant conversion. We put in our, I think it was our May slide deck with regards to funding that was available to automotive suppliers from the administration coming out, and that is also related to electric vehicles and trying to support the downstream supply chains. And you're starting to see $1.7 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act going to 11 either closed or at-risk auto manufacturing and assembly facilities in 8 states to manufacture EVs and help out the supply chain. So those dollars are there. The reason we put this up here, it's just not an advertisement for Biden. It's more of, for those of you that are in the supply chains, should be, especially if you're geographically located in one of these areas, somebody in your sales shop should be reaching out to these OEMs, tier ones, and your customers saying, where's this money going? How are we using it? And make sure some of this comes back to your local tool machine shops and other manufacturers, stampers and formers and others. Commerce is in line also to give out more funding. This is more on the tech hubs. This is also going down, that will trickle down to partnerships that are going to be required with industry. If you are located in one of these areas, you should feel free to reach out to them. I could see someone, for example, Rocky Mountain, NTMA, maybe down the line, being able to process or partner with some of those folks, New Hampshire, on some of these as well. So something to keep in mind as those dollars keep rolling out. Similar on the youth build, this one is going to require some. This one does have eligibility for nonprofits and foundation dollars as well for those that are involved in youth programs that are either on their own or partnering with other groups. Something to look out for, dollars bringing them back home. And then lastly, on regulatory, before we jump into trade, tariff, supply chains and get ready to wrap up here in about 5 minutes, there just do want to flag that on the clean steel production grants that have been awarded, EPA put $160 million out there on the construction materials. So again, you're still seeing more dollars going out towards these industries. The Department of Energy also has been putting out quite a bit of funding in trying to reduce the emissions that come from certain materials and that they're using for construction, but some of those technologies and processes will obviously bleed over to other manufacturing of those metals as well. And speaking of metals, the White House on July 10th, they put out a new melted and poured proclamation, and this deals with some of the issues that we've spoken about. We had a meeting with USTR last month where we talked about transshipment of products that we make coming in from Mexico through China, through Mexico from China, and in response, the administration worked with some industries under the 232 language, and is now requiring that steel be melted and poured in North America in order to be eligible for duty-free and tariff-free import. And that's a nod to what's going on with some of the products coming in from China, as I mentioned. There's a little back and forth on whether or not this includes an exemption for Brazilian steel that is going to be then shaped and changed down and cut down in Mexico or not. But regardless, this certainly targets China and should work to stem the flow and gives you a precursor in what to expect, regardless if it's Trump or Harris in the next administration negotiating and updating the new NAFTA, the USMCA, by July of 2026. That proclamation was very odd in that it was retroactive. It came out on July 10th. It was announced that morning, mid-morning Eastern, but it had already taken effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern time with regards to immediately providing a tariff. Now, it does include bumpers for automotive, including, I believe, some stamped that were covered under the 232, but it did not go further than that. And that's why we reached out to Customs and Border Protection, reached out to U.S. Trade Representative with regards to expanding these requirements to beyond the steel, as this just creates more challenges for those steel users that are out there. On the smelt and cast, this is now the aluminum, similar language on there. There's also some additional requirements. It was focused not just on China, but on Russia, Belarus, and Iran with regards to this area as well. And Paul, feel free to jump in anytime I know you're doing some work with the coalition folks and gotten some inquiries on these as well. The other area that the aluminum folks are concerned about is the proclamation must be accompanied by certificate of analysis, and in order to receive that duty-free and tariff-free treatment, and that you cannot contain any primary aluminum for which that primary country of smelt, secondary country of smelt, or most recent cast is China and Russia. So that certification of analysis also, for again, many of you are not importing directly, but this not only can address some pricing challenges, but also might start dealing with delays. If you're starting to hear about delays of aluminum smelt and cast imports, this might be part of the reason because of the certification. So start planning and considering that if you are bringing it out ahead of it with your service center, your provider, with whom you're else dealing with, especially in looking at that secondary country of smelt, the most recent cast, final solid state. Again, this is directly from the proclamation that came out on July 10th. And then just to get ready to wrap us up, just a couple of quick items, just wanted to float out for you. This is a couple of things that have been happening here. We have had these kinds of slides on and off, and you're looking at the ports on the West Coast getting quite a bit busy. Obviously, I mean, we were shopping recently and we've already seen Halloween outfits already out and posted. A couple of reasons for that. There's some strike negotiations going on in the ports. There's also concerns about the Biden tariffs that were delayed, that were slated to have taken effect yesterday on August 1st, that have now been put for a little bit as they continue to go through all the comments that they received on the 301 and their new EV and other tariff increases on metals that they were looking at. So the ports have definitely increased, and there's also the clear concern that Trump might win the election. And most of these are obviously done before they switch over to Harris. Durable good orders declined quite a bit. Number 6.6% is a pretty significant drop. And again, we watch on the durable goods, new orders there. We've seen some of your old numbers that are telling us things are starting to slow down. And we also saw that with the jobs report that I think was 163, 143, something like that up. So those things are starting to slow down there as well on that. A couple of things on the member support side as we turned over to Bracewell to go through some of the media, since it's been a busy season around here for them.
Thanks, Omar. It's Paul here. This is the time of year before an election that our members, we get a lot of requests from the media to talk to our members as we set up for the election. And there's a lot of stories regarding how the economy is doing and what manufacturers are thinking about. This is a Wall Street Journal sample that we had one of our One Voice members participate in. There was a Barron story, also not up here, where we had a reporter visit a member and talk about the impact of steel tariffs. We have a Washington Post inquiry, very specific, that just came in today about wanting to visit a manufacturer in Erie County, Pennsylvania. So if you're in Erie County, reach out to your associations or reach out to me. So just a reminder that if you do want to participate in these interviews, we have a media volunteers list that is handled through your associations. If you do get an inquiry about that you want help on, please contact Caitlin and myself, because a lot of reporters will want to ask you about who you're going to vote for and things like that. And there's ways to promote manufacturing in your businesses without getting into the politics of it. And we're very good at that. So Just keep us posted and look for your media volunteers. Look at your emails. There will be some opportunities for you forthcoming. And speaking of politics, if you want to talk about politics, if you want to hear about politics and how it impacts manufacturing and the latest on the presidential elections, please tune into our One Voice podcast where you can hear. We talk a lot about what's going on with the presidential campaign and what's going on in politics, as well as some of the issues that you talked about here. We pop up a new one every 2 weeks. We'll be recording one next week. So it's available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you, Paul. Again, as always, any support is always appreciated as we continue to keep these webinars going. We've got a busy regulatory season ahead of us. And obviously on the legislative front, there's been quite a bit in here. Please file any questions that you've got. As Caitlin said, hover down below, you'll see the Q&A. Please type in any questions that you've got. You can always reach out to Jenny over at NTMA, Christy at PMA, ourselves. Anytime, we're happy to be helpful in any way we can. We know there's a lot of questions, especially on that OSHA proposed heat rule as it comes out. And we'll stick around here for another 30 seconds or so. Anybody feel free to type any questions that you might have. We're happy to be helpful. Okay. Not seeing anything come through or anyone unmuting. All right, folks. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend, and we will talk to you in about a month.